Hello, I'm Emma, and I'm here to explore thou vs the word thou is a second-person singular pronoun in English. It is now largely archaic, having been replaced in most contexts by the word you, although it remains in use in parts of northern England and in Scots. Thou is the nominative form. The oblique/adjective form is the, functioning as both accusative and dative. The possessive is thy adjective or thine, as an adjective before a vowel or as a possessive pronoun. And the reflexive is thyself. When thou is the grammatical subject of a finite verb in the indicative mood, the verb form typically ends in e-sant, e.g. thou goest, thou do, e-sant, but in some cases just t, e.g. thou art. Thou shalt. Originally thou in was simply the singular counterpart to the plural pronoun ye, derived from an ancient Indo-European root. In Middle English, thou was sometimes represented with a scribal abbreviation that put a small u over the letter thorn. Later, in printing presses that lacked this letter, this abbreviation was sometimes rendered as e. Starting in the 1300 seconds, thou and thee were used to express familiarity, formality, or contempt, for addressing strangers, superiors, or inferiors, or in situations when indicating singularity to avoid confusion was needed. Concurrently, the plural forms ye and you began to also be used for singular, typically for addressing rulers, superiors, equals, inferiors, parents, younger persons, and significant others. In the 17th century, thou fell into disuse in the standard language, often regarded as impolite, but persisted, sometimes in an altered form, in regional dialects of England and Scotland, as well as in the language of such religious groups as the Society of Friends. The use of the pronoun is also still present in Christian prayer and in poetry. Early English translations of the Bible used the familiar singular form of the second person, which mirrors common usage trends in other languages. The familiar and singular form is used when speaking to God in French, in Protestantism both in past and present, in Catholicism since the post-Vatican II reforms, German, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Scottish Gaelic and many others, all of which maintain the use of an informal singular form of the second person in modern speech. In addition, the translators of the King James Version of the Bible attempted to maintain the distinction found in Biblical Hebrew, Aramaic and Koine Greek between singular and plural second-person pronouns and verb forms. So they used thou, thee, thy, and thine for singular, and ye, you, your, and yours for plural. In standard modern English, thou continues to be used in formal religious contexts, in wedding ceremonies, I thee wed, in literature that seeks to reproduce archaic language, and in certain fixed phrases such as fare thee well. For this reason, many associate the pronoun with solemnity or formality. Many dialects have compensated for the lack of a singular/plural distinction, caused by the disappearance of thou and ye through the creation of new plural pronouns or pronominals, such as yins, yous and y'all, or the colloquial you guys, you lot in England. Ye remains common in some parts of Ireland, but the examples just given vary regionally and are usually restricted to colloquial speech. The evolution of you reveals a surprising and complex story of shifting social dynamics. Because thou has passed out of common use, its traditional forms are often confused by those imitating archaic speech. The etymology of you reveals a surprising and complex history, and now we'll explore its fascinating declension. The English personal pronouns have standardized declension according to the following table. The evolution of you reveals a surprising and complex story of shifting social dynamics. Verb forms used after thou generally end in est, pronounced, or sant in the indicative mood in both the present and the past tenses. These forms are used for both strong and weak verbs. Typical examples of the standard present and past tense forms follow. The e in the ending is optional. Early English spelling had not yet been standardized. In verse, the choice about whether to use the e often depended upon considerations of meter to know. Thou knowest, thou knewest to drive, thou drivest, thou drovest to make, thou makest, thou madest to love, thou lovest, thou lovedst to want, thou wantest, thou wantedst. Modal verbs also have e, sant added to their forms can, thou canst, could, thou couldst, may, thou mayest, might, thou mightst, should, thou shouldst, would, thou wouldst, ought to, thou oughtest to. A few verbs have irregular thou forms, to be, thou art or thou beest, thou wast or subjunctive thou wert. Originally thou were to have, thou hast, thou hadst to do. Thou dost or thou doest in non-auxiliary use and thou didst, shall, thou shalt, will, thou wilt. A few others are not inflected, must, thou must. In Proto-English, the second-person singular verb inflection was ease. This came down unchanged from Indo-European and can be seen in quite distantly related Indo-European languages. Russian znayeshayeri znaish thou knowest, Latin armors thou lovest. This is parallel to the history of the third-person form in Old English eth, Russian znayete, znayet he knoweth, Latin amat he loveth. The from ease to modern English est, which took place separately at around the same time in the closely related German and West Frisian languages, is understood to be caused by an assimilation of the consonant of the pronoun, which often followed the verb. This is most readily observed in German. Liebst du right arrow, liebst du, lovest thou. There are some speakers of modern English that use thou/thee, but use thee as the subject and conjugate the word with is/was. That is, thee is, thee was, thee has, thee speaks, thee spoke, thee can, thee could. However, this is not considered standard. The concept of you has a surprisingly complex and layered history, and now we'll explore the fascinating evolution of this seemingly simple pronoun. In Dutch, the equivalent of thou, du, also became archaic and fell out of use, and was replaced by the Dutch equivalent of you, jij, later jij or you, just as it has in English, with the place of the informal plural taken by jullie, compare English y'all. In the subjunctive and imperative moods, the ending in e, sunt is dropped, although it is generally retained in thou wert, the second-person singular past subjunctive of the verb to be. The subjunctive forms are used when a statement is doubtful or contrary to fact. As such, they frequently occur after if and the poetic and. If thou be Johann, I tell it thee, write with a good advice, Middle English carol. If thou be Johann, I tell it the writ with a good adice, thou may be glad Johann to be it is a name of price. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, I do wish thou wert a dog that I might love thee something, and thou bring Alexander and his paramour before the Emperor Albiactian. O wert thou in the cooled blast, I'd shelter thee. In modern regional English dialects that use thou or some variant, such as in Yorkshire and Lancashire, it often takes the third-person form of the verb s. This comes from a merging of early modern English second-person singular ending, sunt and third-person singular ending s into s, the latter a northern variation of thorn, th. The present indicative form art, thu eat, goes back to West Saxon Old English coedsvbiv 18, and eventually became standard, even in the South, e.g. in Shakespeare and the Bible. For its influence also from the North, cf. Icelandic thu ert. The preterite indicative of be is generally thou wast. The word you has a surprisingly complex and layered past, and now we'll explore its origins. Thou originates from Old English, and ultimately via Grimm's law from the Proto-Indo-European too, with the expected Germanic vowel lengthening in accented monosyllabic words with an open syllable. Thou is therefore cognate with Icelandic and Old Norse, German and continental Scandinavian, Latin and all major Romance languages, Irish, Kurdish, Lithuanian and Latvian, or Greek, Slavic ter yeru/tai or teris/ti, Armenian / Hindi, he-tu, ain, Bengali, Bantui ain tui, Persian and Sanskrit hitvam. A cognate form of this pronoun exists in almost every other Indo-European language. The word you has a surprisingly ancient and complex past, so let's delve into its origins in Old and Middle English. In Old English, thou was governed by a simple rule. Thou addressed one person, and ye more than one. Beginning in the 1,300 seconds, thou was gradually replaced by the plural ye as the form of address for a superior person, and later for an equal. For a long time, however, thou remained the most common form for addressing an inferior person. The practice of matching singular and plural forms with informal and formal connotations is called the TV distinction, and in English is largely due to the influence of French. This began with the practice of addressing kings and other aristocrats in the plural. Eventually, this was generalized, as in French, to address any social superior or stranger with a plural pronoun, which was felt to be more polite. In French, tu was eventually considered either intimate or condescending, and to a stranger, potentially insulting, while the plural form vous was reserved and formal. Now, let's explore the general decline in early modern English. Fairly suddenly in the 17th century, thou began to decline in the standard language, that is, particularly in and around London, often regarded as impolite or ambiguous in terms of politeness. It persisted, sometimes in an altered form, particularly in regional dialects of England and Scotland farther from London, as well as in the language of such religious groups as the Society of Friends. Reasons commonly maintained by modern linguists as to the decline of thou in the 17th century include the increasing identification of you with polite society, and the uncertainty of using thou for inferiors versus you for superiors, with you being the safer default, amidst the rise of a new middle class. In the 18th century, Samuel Johnson, in A Grammar of the English Tongue, wrote, In the language of ceremony, the second-person plural is used for the second-person singular, implying that thou was still in everyday familiar use for the second-person singular, while you could be used for the same grammatical person, but only for formal contexts. However, Samuel Johnson himself was born and raised not in the south of England, but in the West Midlands, specifically Lichfield, Staffordshire, where the usage of thou persists until the present day, see below. So it is not surprising that he would consider it entirely ordinary and describe it as such. By contrast, for most speakers of southern British English, thou had already fallen out of everyday use, even in familiar speech, by sometime around 1650. Thou persisted in a number of religious, literary and regional contexts, and those pockets of continued use of the pronoun tended to undermine the obsolescence of the TV distinction. One notable consequence of the decline in use of the second-person singular, pronouns thou, thy, and thee is the obfuscation of certain socio-cultural elements of early modern English texts, such as many character interactions in Shakespeare's plays, which were mostly written from 1589 to 1613. Although Shakespeare is far from consistent in his writings, his characters primarily tend to use thou rather than you. When addressing another who is a social subordinate, a close friend or family member, or a hated wrongdoer, the concept of you has a surprisingly complex and ancient lineage, so let's delve into its origins. Many European languages contain verbs meaning to address with the informal pronoun, such as German, French, Spanish, and Swedish, Dutch, Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, Romanian, Hungarian, Finnish, and so on. Additionally, the Norwegian noun refers to the practice of using this familiar form of address instead of the / formal forms in common use. Although uncommon in English, the usage did appear, such as at the trial of Sir Walter Raleigh in 1603, when Sir Edward Coke, prosecuting for the Crown, reportedly sought to insult Raleigh by saying, "I thou thee, thou traitor." In modern English, I thou you, you traitor, here using thou as a verb meaning to call someone thou or thee. Although the practice never took root in standard English, it occurs in dialectal speech in the north of England, a formerly common refrain in Yorkshire dialect for admonishing children who misused the familiar form was, "Don't thee thar them as thars thee." In modern English, don't you thar those who thar you. In other words, don't use the familiar form thar towards those who refer to you as thar. Thar being the local dialectal variant of thou, and similar in Lancashire dialect. Don't thee me thee, I's you to thee. In standard English, don't thee me you, I'm you to you. The word you has a surprisingly complex and often overlooked history rooted in religious doctrine. Many conservative Christians use thee, thou, thy and thine when addressing God in prayer. In the Plymouth Brethren Catechism Gathering Unto His Name, Norman Crawford explains the practice. When referring to God, thou, as with other pronouns, is often capitalized, e.g., for thou hast delivered my soul from death. As William Tyndale translated the Bible into English in the early 16th century, he preserved the singular and plural distinctions that he found in his Hebrew and Greek originals. He used thou for the singular, and ye for the plural regardless of the relative status of the speaker and the addressee. Tyndale's usage was standard for the period and mirrored that found in the earlier Wycliffe's Bible and the later King James Bible. But as the use of thou in non-dialect English began to decline in the 18th century, its meaning nonetheless remained familiar from the widespread use of the latter translation. The Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which first appeared in 1946, retained the pronoun thou exclusively to address God, using you in other places. This was done to preserve the tone, at once intimate and reverent, that would be familiar to those who knew the King James Version and read the Psalms and similar text in devotional use. The New American Standard Bible, 1971, made the same decision, but the revision of 1995 New American Standard Bible, updated edition, reversed it. Similarly, the 1989 Revised English Bible dropped all forms of thou that had appeared in the earlier New English Bible, 1970. The New Revised Standard Version, 1989, omits thou entirely and claims that it is incongruous and contrary to the original intent of the use of thou in Bible translation to adopt a distinctive pronoun to address the deity. The 1662 Book of Common Prayer, which is still an authorized form of worship in the Church of England, and much of the Anglican Communion, also uses the word thou to refer to the singular second person. Quakers traditionally used thee as an ordinary pronoun as part of their testimony of simplicity, a practice continued by certain conservative friends. The stereotype has them saying thee for both nominative and accusative cases. This was started at the beginning of the Quaker movement by George Fox, who called it plain speaking, as an attempt to preserve the egalitarian familiarity associated with the pronoun. Most Quakers have abandoned this usage. At its beginning, the Quaker movement was particularly strong in the northwestern areas of England, and particularly in the North Midlands area. The preservation of thee in Quaker speech may relate to this history. Modern Quakers who choose to use this manner of plain speaking often use the thee form without any corresponding change in verb form. For example, is thee or was thee. In Latter-day Saint prayer tradition, the terms thee and thou are always and exclusively used to address God, as a mark of respect. The concept of you has a surprisingly complex and ancient lineage, and now we'll explore its roots in the religious traditions of Islam and be adjective acute faith. In many of the Quranic translations, particularly those compiled by the Ahmadiyya, the terms thou and thee are used. One particular example is the Holy Quran Arabic text and English translation, translated by Maulvi Sher Ali. In the English translations of the scripture of the adjective acute faith, the terms thou and thee are also used. Shoghai Effendi, the head of the religion in the first half of the 20th century, adopted a style that was somewhat removed from everyday discourse when translating the texts from their original Arabic or Persian to capture some of the poetic and metaphorical nature of the text in the original languages, and to convey the idea that the text was to be considered holy. The word you has a surprisingly complex and ancient lineage, revealing a hidden history of power and social hierarchy. Like his contemporaries, William Shakespeare uses thou both in the intimate, French-style sense, and also to emphasize differences of rank, but he is by no means consistent in using the word, and friends and lovers sometimes call each other ye or you as often as they call each other thou, sometimes in ways that can be analyzed for meaning, but often apparently at random. For example, in the following passage from Henry IV, Shakespeare has Falstaff use both forms with Henry. Initially using you, in confusion on waking he then switches to a comfortable and intimate thou. Prince, thou art so fat-witted with drinking of old sack, and unbuttoning thee after supper, and sleeping upon benches after noon, that thou hast forgotten to demand that truly which thou wouldest truly know. What a devil hast thou to do with the time of the day? Falstaff, indeed you come near me now, Hal, and I prithee, sweet wag, when thou art a king, as God save thy grace majesty, I should say, for grace thou wilt have none. While in Hamlet, Shakespeare uses discordant second-person pronouns to express Hamlet's antagonism towards his mother. Queen Gertrude, Hamlet, thou hast thy father much offended. Hamlet, mother, you have my father much offended. The concept of you has a surprisingly complex and layered history, evolving far beyond its simple meaning. Except where everyday use survives in some regions of England, the air of informal familiarity once suggested by the use of thou has disappeared. It is used often for the opposite effect with solemn ritual occasions, in readings from the King James Bible, in Shakespeare, and in formal literary compositions that intentionally seek to echo these older styles. Since becoming obsolete in most dialects of spoken English, it has nevertheless been used by more recent writers to address exalted beings such as God, a skylark, Achilles, and even the mighty Thor. In The Empire Strikes Back, Darth Vader addresses the Emperor with the words, "What is thy bidding, my master?" In Leonard Cohen's song Bird on the Wire, he promises his beloved that he will reform, saying, "I will make it all up to thee." In Diana Ross's song, Upside Down, written by Cheiks Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards, there is the lyric, "Respectfully I say to thee, I'm aware that you're cheatin'." In Will You Be There, Michael Jackson sings, "Hold me slash like the river Jordan slash, and I will then say to thee slash, you are my friend." Notably, both Ross's and Jackson's lyrics combine thee with the usual form you. The converse, the use of the second-person singular ending, est for the third person, also occurs, "So sayest Thor," spoken by Thor. This usage often shows up in modern parody and pastiche in an attempt to make speech appear either archaic or formal. The forms thou and thee are often transposed. The word you has a surprisingly complex and layered past, and now we'll explore its current usage. You is now the standard English second-person pronoun, and encompasses both the singular and plural senses. In some dialects, however, thou has persisted, and in others thou is retained for poetic and slash or literary use. It also survives as a fossil word in the commonly used phrase, holier than thou. The curious evolution of you reveals a surprisingly complex and layered history. In traditional dialects, thou is used in the English counties of Cumberland, Westmoreland, Durham, Lancashire, Yorkshire, Staffordshire, Derbyshire, and some western parts of Nottinghamshire. The Survey of Anglo-Welsh Dialects, which began in 1968, found that thou persisted in scattered sites across Clwyd, Dyfed, Powys and West Glamorgan. Such dialects normally also preserve distinct verb forms for the singular second person. For example, the goest, Standard English, you could, archaic, thou couldst, in northern Staffordshire. Throughout rural Yorkshire, the old distinction between nominative and adjective is preserved. The possessive is often written as thy in local dialect writings, but is pronounced as an unstressed thar, and the possessive pronoun has in modern usage almost exclusively followed other English dialects in becoming yours or the local word yawn, from your one. Nominative, objective, genitive, possessive, second person singular thar thee thy thar, yours/yawn. The apparent incongruity between the archaic nominative, objective, and genitive forms of this pronoun on the one hand, and the modern possessive form on the other, may be a signal that the linguistic drift of Yorkshire dialect is causing thar to fall into disuse, although a measure of local pride in the dialect may be counteracting this. Some other variants are specific to certain areas. In Sheffield, the initial consonant was pronounced as /d/, which led to the nickname of the D-Dars for people from Sheffield. In Lancashire and West Yorkshire, tar was used as an unstressed shortening of thou, which can be found in the song On Ilkla Moor Bart. Although K.M. Pettit found this form to have been largely displaced from urban West Yorkshire in his 1907-1 fieldwork. In rural North Lancashire between Lancaster and the North Yorkshire border thar is preserved in colloquial phrases such as what would thar like for thy tea? What would you like for your dinner? And a pen thar wain't, perhaps you won't, happen being the dialect word for perhaps and thar knows, you know. This usage in Lancashire is becoming rare, except for elderly and rural speakers. A well-known routine by comedian Peter Kay from Bolton, Greater Manchester, historically in Lancashire, features the phrase has thar nout moist. Have you got nothing moist? The use of the word thee in the song, I Predict a Riot by Leeds band Kaiser Chiefs. Watching the people get leery / is not very pretty, I tell thee, caused some comment by people who were unaware that the word is still in use in the Yorkshire dialect. The word thee is also used in the song Upside Down, respectfully. I say to thee / I'm aware that you're cheating. The use of the phrase thar knows has been widely used in various songs by Arctic Monkeys, a band from High Green, a suburb of Sheffield. Alex Turner, the band's lead singer, has also often replaced words with thar knows during live versions of the songs. The use persists somewhat in the West Country dialects, albeit somewhat affected. Some of the Wurzels songs include Drink Up Thy Cider and Sniff Up Thy Snuff. Thu has also been used in the Orcadian Scots dialect in place of the singular informal thou. In Shetland dialect, the other form of insular Scots, do and d, are used. The word thou has been reported in the Northern Scots Cromarty dialect as being in common use in the first half of the 20th century, and by the time of its extinction only in occasional use. The concept of you has a surprisingly complex and layered history, and now we'll explore how it evolved into the everyday language we use today. Many dialects have compensated for the lack of a singular/plural distinction, caused by the disappearance of thou and ye through the creation of new plural pronouns or pronominals, such as yins or you guys, used by some Australians and in what are generally considered working-class dialects in and near cities in the northeastern United States, y'all in the southern United States, and you lot in England. Ye remains common in some parts of Ireland, but the examples just given vary regionally and are usually restricted to colloquial speech. The forms vary across the English-speaking world and between literature and the spoken language. Bore Albert Celsius and Thomas Cable. A History of the English Language, 5th Edinburgh, J. A. Turville Petter Thorlak. A Book of Middle English, Daniel David. The Bible in English, Its History and Influence, Smith, Jeremy. A Historical Study of English, Form, Function and Change, Thou Pers Pron, 2nd Sing. Oxford English Dictionary, 2nd edition, 1989. Oxford English Dictionary Trudgell, Peter. 1999, Blackwell Publishing. Dialects of England. The concept of you has a surprisingly complex and layered past, rooted in ancient distinctions.